in our history. Um, However, my work and kind of my passion really lies on the other end of that spectrum, where we're really working on a sustainable and just future that we all deserve. So I thought it was worth noting at the beginning of this how the work that you all do and how this conference really focuses on what's the best possible in humanity. And so on that road, there's a lot of number of kind of nuts and bolts questions I could ask that need to be addressed, these day-to-day challenges that need to be focused on. And I'm really excited to be here today with two people who are going to share their expertise in overcoming those challenges. So first off, we have Daniel Gray, who's a consumer advocate and clean energy entrepreneur who founded the Ohio Citizens Utility Board back in 2019. Cub Ohio is a nonprofit organization that works to protect the interests of utility customers and promote environmental sustainability. Under Gray's leadership, Cub Ohio has played a key role in advancing environmental sustainability in Ohio. The organization has successfully advocated for policies that support renewable energy development, energy efficiency programs, and electric vehicle infrastructure. Also with me today is Mayor Barbara Buffalo. Mayor Buffalo is the current mayor of Columbia, Missouri, and was the first elected in 2022. She's a passionate advocate for environmental sustainability. And in fact, she served as the city's first sustainability director or sustainability manager and has a deep understanding of these issues. Honestly, I don't think we can ask for a better climate champion to be in office. Under Mayor Buffalo's leadership, Columbia has made significant progress on sustainability. The city has ambitious goals to reduce its greenhouse gases emissions and increase reliance on renewable energy. Buffalo has worked to promote energy efficiency and sustainable transportation. So I know we're not live, but I'd love you all to welcome both of our speakers here today. So I'm going to kick it off to Daniel. If you want to start off, I'm not sure if I'm able to share my screen, but he has a slideshow we were going to do. If not, Daniel, I will hand it off to you and I will work on getting the slideshow up.
Would you like me to try to get the...
Here, I just changed this. You should be able to share directly. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great. So Daniel, if you want to go, I can run the slideshow.
Excellent. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Hold on. There we go. Okay, I can see everything now. So thank you all for joining today and inviting me to come speak. So I'm going to talk primarily about lessons from Cleveland, the work that we're doing around Cleveland Public Power municipal reform. I have to say I'm very jealous of Traverse City. So great presentation. I would love to be in the situation that you all are in there, and I'm definitely going to be hitting you all up to hopefully connect you with the folks at Cleveland's leadership about some of those great programs that you talked about and that you're working on. So I'm going to jump in. If you can hit the next slide. And I apologize for the wordiness of the slides. I'm going to try to keep within my 10 minutes with this nonetheless. So one thing I want to talk about, and even before I get in, most of this presentation is really aimed at working within a municipal utility that has at least expressed interest and you're able to build a relationship. So I'd call it a sympathetic leadership. But even in this case, and because of that, a lot of what I'm talking about is we balance this with our coalition that we're building in Cleveland, how we weight the inside game, kind of working directly with stakeholders and leadership versus the outside game and the public pressure piece. And I'm sure a lot of the folks in the call are much more oriented towards outside. We're constantly looking at how to balance this, but this presentation is going to be a lot more focused on the inside game piece because we are building a strong relationship with the leadership of Cleveland Public Power. So the whole theme of what I'm going to talk about is making sure as we're advocates, either working directly with the community stakeholders or creating public pressure campaigns, is making sure that we're recognizing the context in which we're operating in. I know this was a major theme of what we talked about as well in the report that was shared yesterday. So, while many of us are working to change the leadership and attitudes of our municipalities, we have to keep in mind, these are highlights of a few pieces of context, and it's going to be different for every community, but I think a lot of these are universal. So one is leadership. We do need good leadership. It's going to be much, much easier to work with receptive leadership, and whether that means changing the leadership directly through our partners in C4 organizations like our friends at Climate Cabinet, and or taking direct action from folks like Mayor Buffalo did when she chose to step up and run for office. It's necessary often for change, but replacing that leadership itself is often not enough. The other piece of context is these key relationships. So most munis and co-ops, it doesn't sound like Traverse City as much as, which is great, to some of these others, they're heavily reliant upon relationships with outside entities, that those relationships are difficult to untangle, and they often come with logistical and potentially financial and certainly capacity burdens that we have to understand and work through in order to enact reform. And then the other, which is related but could happen to anyone, I suppose, is these existing contracts and kind of that same time period that our friends in Traverse City talked about 10 to 15 years ago, where munis and co-ops were under a great deal of pressure and stress to stay independent. There was also a large transition in generation in which a lot of communities entered into long-term contracts that are, again, difficult to break or even reform. And so we need to keep these contexts in mind, both with building those inside relationships, even with folks that have sympathetic leadership. And so in order to do that, we need to understand that context and then be creative and opportunistic about our opportunities and take advantage of all the tools and resources we have through coalitions and partnerships and groups like this in order to successfully make progress. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dive into Cleveland. So I would say that as of 2 to 3 years ago, we did not have sympathetic leadership in Cleveland. And so as we started Cub Ohio, and my role is to primarily work on local policy and local advocacy, we looked at Cleveland Public Power, which is the largest municipal utility in the state. It's very unique, which I'll get into in a little bit. Serves over 70,000 meters and about half of the city of Cleveland. And so with leadership in Cleveland, we wanted to change the relationship between Cleveland Public Power and the community so that they were more open about progress and really would directly engage with this coalition and this community of experts that we brought together so that we were in the position to directly supply resources to the city, which really is very, very strapped both financially and just from a capacity and innovation standpoint. So the background to that is we did have a new mayor sworn in 2022 on a platform of reform, including specifically calling out Cleveland Public Power reform. And then he brought in a new commissioner who was hired in late last year, who was brought in from out of state from the Western Area Power Authority in California. But the challenges still remained, even with this new leadership. So even with the mayor committed to reform, the issue was not a top priority, which is probably not surprising for the leadership of the city of Cleveland, which is dealing with equity challenges across the board, not just energy. And, you know, not only snow clearing and potholes and the usual pieces, but there is also, you know, significant financial burdens, significant Justice Department burdens that they were dealing with on an equity standpoint. And also just late in the game, the new commissioner did not come in until late last year, you know, new to the area, new to this very unique relationship that Cleveland Public Power has with our investor-owned utility that serves the area. And it took a while to get started. And even though he was replaced and brought in, much of the existing bureaucracy still remains. So again, this is kind of getting to that theme of we can change the leadership and you may need to change the leadership. That doesn't mean that all of the structural challenges have been replaced. So how do we go about, next slide, how do we go about starting to change that relationship by being opportunistic to this new opportunity? So our strategy was get in early and often and leverage all the relationships and resources that we have within our coalition. So how do we get in early? How are we persistent? How are we creative? So the first thing is we met with the now mayor and key staff before the election to elevate the issue. This allowed us to get public comment, to take action. And the way we were able to do this was by leveraging relationships with C4s that were actively working in the political space. So we knew this was a targeted race. We were able to build on those relationships, and we were able to get in and have educational C3 conversations before the election while running as a candidate to elevate those issues and get public comment for Cleveland Public Power reform, and as well on some of these existing contracts. Then once the mayor went into office, we obviously continued to work with and try to elevate the issue directly with those key staff, but we also knew that a new commissioner was coming, and we actively influenced and monitored the hiring of the new commissioner, including submitting some white papers and some perspective pieces to allow us to influence that process and ensure that they were bringing in a commissioner that would hopefully be sympathetic to these issues, open to working with us from the get-go, and up to including one of the creative things we did was we actually had a stalking horse candidate apply to that job, so we were able to in real time understand what was happening in the process, know what the conversations we're having, what the interview questions were along the way. And actually, you're looking at the guinea pig who went through that process directly. That was one of the more creative things we did. And then once the commissioner was in place, we were able to establish regular outreach to the commissioner. So by having that relationship with the mayor, by bringing in a sympathetic commissioner, we were able to leverage those relationships with key staff to essentially have the mayor tell the commissioner in our coalition's first meeting with him, I think the direct quote is, "You're working with these guys, right?" And his answer was, "I am now, sir." So we were able to establish that direct line of communication. But we had to nuance that, and that relationship's just beginning, but the open communication was on their terms. So we went to meet with them at their offices. We asked them what their needs are, what their capital constraints, what their priorities were, while still remaining open and clear about our point of view. So that we are nonprofits, that we are funded, that we do want to see a clean and equitable transition, and we are going to hold them accountable to their goals of 100% renewable energy by 2040. The results is that we've set up a technical working group with the commissioner to work on tangible short-term wins like community solar, local generation, and federal grant support. So when we go back to that outcome that we wanted to achieve, where we can start to directly bring resources in to help supplement the innovation and the transition, we were able to do that by taking this approach. So the next piece of context, next slide, was on these understanding the key relationships, right? So we wanted to, the key relationships here are First Energy and AMP, American Municipal Power. I'll talk about them a little bit more here, but we wanted more aggressive oversight approach to the relationship with AMP, and to help CPP, who understands very well their constraints of working with First Energy, our local investor-owned utility, help them directly, 2 slides forward. Yep. Directly work on strategies that understands the context of that relationship with First Energy and is actually in direct alignment with Cleveland Public Power and basically 100% not in alignment with the investor-owned utility. So helping them build on that misalignment. So the background here is, in a fairly unique circumstance in the country, Cleveland Public Power is actually in direct competition with First Energy. In the parts of the city that Cleveland Public Power operates, there are actually 2 sets of monopoly utility distribution wires, which is kind of wild. It's also, like most municipal utilities, it's on an island to PJM, our regional transmission organization. Therefore, all transmission of power that's coming into the city that's not generated by within the distribution grid is delivered by First Energy. And then turning to AMP, American Municipal Power, they serve as their generation and transmission organization, providing all generation and transmission services to Cleveland Public Power. And AMP's leadership is controlled by dozens of municipals across multiple states, all with different challenges and different agendas. So in order to change that relationship with AMP, it's either changing the relationship that they perceive in the oversight that they have directly as a partner and a customer of AMP. It's not in the short term, because there's not a short-term solution to directly changing the position of AMP because of the structure of that. So we need to understand that context. And as well as we'll get into the contract piece, AMP is actually the counterparty to these long-term generation contracts that the city's become stuck in. So there's a conflict of interest with AMP beyond the existing G&T relationship. So as I kind of talked about, they're limited in their ability to access low-cost out-of-service territory offerings. They're limited in making rate structure changes without endangering their market share or creating an artificial death spiral, because First Energy is able to cherry pick at will the most valuable customers, and really has taken a lot of the largest, most valuable commercial and industrial customers, leaving Cleveland in a position where they're really strapped in their ability to lower rates to residential customers, which are primarily low income and equity communities. And again, I talked about kind of the relationship and the challenges with AMP. Also, by delegating all of the purchasing power from the wholesale market to AMP, there's a really strong asymmetric access to information challenge when it comes to AMP and trying to develop their own strategies. So how are we trying to change that? Next slide, please. Okay, and I'm almost out of time, so I'll
Daniel, you're fine. You can go a little longer. Can you define what AMP is again?
It's American Municipal Power. So it is a generation and transmission organization that services dozens of communities. It started in Ohio. It's mostly in Ohio, but across the Mid-Atlantic as well.
Thanks a
So
lot.
how are we working to try to do this? So we understand the intersection and power. We worked by understanding the intersection of power dynamics between these key relationships and try to exploit the misaligned values to deepen that relationship with us and develop strategies that work for Cleveland Public Power now and help move them towards more aggressive strategies in the future. So here are some of the things we did. So we're starting to power map AMP and catalog similar challenges across the other communities that are being served by AMP. And then when it comes to long-term contracts, other communities that are in similar organizations in other states. The second is, and this is part of meeting them where they're at right now, limit our solutions proposals to work around the existing context. And in this, we're talking about sort of being islanded and working within a hostile transmission organization by focusing in the short term on distribution grid solutions. And I don't mean just fixing the distribution grid itself, but if you think of rooftop solar as behind the meter, you could think of community solar as behind the distribution grid. So there are solutions that, as long as they don't touch transmission, they have full autonomy. And understanding that and helping them understand that and working and focusing in on that, we're able to actually focus in on things that they can do right now. The other piece is just education on stakeholders. And this is not just Cleveland Public Power leadership that understands it, but city council, the mayor's office, key staff, the mayor's office, helping them understand this messed up relationship that the city has with American Municipal Power and First Energy that's not necessarily intuitive and certainly is not easy to understand. And then we're starting to create spaces for similar communities. I know this is a highlighted theme of the report that we've all worked on together, to start to work together to build power. Because as I start to talk about in the contracts, we don't just have a problem in and of itself. We have a collective action problem that we have to solve before we can start to actually fix the problem. And then use those to create an attainable roadmap for information gathering. So right now, we don't even know how expensive the power is on some of these contracts that I'll talk about very briefly. We don't even understand how the debt is related to the actual purchase of power. So starting to help the stakeholders understand how that they do have the power to request that information, that they do have resources in our coalition to help them understand that is going to create that momentum to be able to do that. So we're starting to, on the one hand, with solutions, develop to pilot these distribution solutions. And then we're also starting the information gathering directly through the city, which is much more powerful than us trying to advocate from the outside to organizations like American Municipal Power. Last two slides, I promise I'll go fast. And I could talk about this one for a long, long time, so I won't. So we're trying to get more transparency on the costs, ownership, and future outlook of these contracts to aggressively negotiate over the future of these contracts, including exit from Prairie State, and prevent future contract extensions that could further entangle or further extend the life of these contracts. So the background is about 15 years ago, Cleveland Public Power signed a 50-year take-or-leave contract with American Municipal Power to purchase a share of Prairie State Coal and Combined Hydro 2007. These contracts are a blend of power and debt costs, which make them very hard to understand. And the power prices have fluctuated, we think, and have generally been over market, we think, but we have a high degree of confidence. And the challenge is, so one, obviously with the coal plant, it's in direct conflict with the stated goal of 100% renewable energy by a good 15 to 20 years. Very little transparency about the real price, no transparency about material change in plant conditions. The example here is CEJA passed in Illinois will shut down this plant or dramatically reduce the capacity 15 years earlier than the scheduled contract end. Well, what happens now? There's still going to be debt costs, even if you're not purchasing from the take or pay contract. There's been no transparency about those kinds of changing conditions. And then this convoluted ownership structure, which goes to this challenge between a collective action problem with the municipalities themselves. Next piece. So how have we been trying to go after it? Which is we're trying to leverage these short-term wins. Sorry, final slide 8. What we're trying to do is, you can see how this builds, is leverage these short-term wins into long-term action. So we're starting to build relationships at the top. We're starting to educate folks on why these are problematic for meeting their own goals, what the misalignment and the conflict of interest in these relationships are. And so what we're doing that is those short-term wins into acquiring the information on the contract and ownership structure, now be able to more confidently educate these stakeholders on what this structure actually looks like, what the benefit or what the detriments to this relationship have been, and then line up resources both internally. So we're in partnerships with Case Western Reserve University and IEFA, as well as our overall coalition members. And then we've begun to work with advocates across the region to identify communities doing similar research, because what we really, really need is communities to step up and lead. The only way we're going to solve this collective action problem is for somebody to take the first step and start to bring other communities together. And so, we've started with an outside look at contract and financial, contractual and financial pieces to it. We've begun stakeholder engagement, statements of support, engaging with the city law department to collect that detailed information. And we've started dialogue primarily in Illinois to preempt risks of things like carbon capture and other sort of harebrained schemes that may be used to lay the groundwork for longer term contracts, contract modifications coming from our partners, not coming from us, that could potentially further entangle us in the future. Thanks for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Dale. That was it was a lot of fun to hear just about some of the tactics that you were using there. I'm sure we'll get a little more questions as we get into a question section. But now I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Buffalo, talk a little bit about just working hands-on and day to day, and what happens when a sustainability director becomes mayor.
Yeah, that's a good question. Some asked, I was just fed up, with not seeing action happening, and so I just threw my name in there. But no, and Daniel, I appreciate your presentation. I think a lot of the key issues about leadership and about that need to have leadership are important, but the mayor is not the one doing the day-to-day reaching out to find the energy sources. The mayor is not the one in our form of government. In Columbia, we're a council manager form of government. So I don't even hire or fire a utilities director. So I appreciate the comments about that, but it is really about a team collaboration. So just a little bit of background, Columbia, Missouri, we're in the middle of the middle. We're halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City. We are a municipal electric utility. We have both our electric, water, solid waste, all the fun things. And so that means that we account for our electric utility accounts for about 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions associated within our community. And so where we get our electricity is the biggest component of that. When I look at, and I can in a little bit put some links into the chat about some of these numbers I'm talking about. So for us in Columbia, energy emissions by utility, so those associated with our electric utility is about, like I said, like closer to 60%. We also have our MU power plant, Boone Electric, and then natural gas makes up about 25% of that energy emissions. When I look at what our community is doing with that information, obviously, like most communities, it's because of our built environment. So while I'm going to talk a little bit about our municipal power, I think the other thing to tie into this is the relationship between cities are usually the ones also making the building codes. And so as we have this conversation about how we design for the future and where we design these homes and businesses, that's also going to play a key role. Especially if a city is looking into transitioning from natural gas to all electric and then hopefully all renewable. So in Columbia, one of the things that I often talk about is the fact that, I'm bringing up my links, for us, for our greenhouse gas emissions, we also have a 100% renewable energy goal like so many communities. And in the Midwest, as many of you know, it's a little bit hard sometimes to find these resources. So as we're having more and more wind farms or solar farms potentially coming on, we're struggling to get transmission lines that are connecting us to these new resources available to us. Columbia, Missouri was one of the first, we were the first in Missouri to do a renewable energy portfolio standard, which required a certain percentage of our portfolio has to come from renewable energy. That was done by our voters in 2004. So this was a voter initiative that we passed, and then we actually modeled it for the state. And so the state of Missouri actually also has a renewable energy portfolio standard. That was key to getting a lot of this transition happening in Columbia. So in 2004, when our voters came together and talked about this, it was key because it was coming from them. Now, they did have a rate cap on it, and we still have that today, that any renewable resource can't be 3% over a traditional coal or other resource. So the rate cap is still there, and we're still dealing with it today. Though in some years past, we have had it be cheaper, our renewable energy, than the purchase of some of our coal. So right now, the City of Columbia 2022 numbers, about 18.2% of our electricity within Columbia Water and Light was from renewable resources. We have a goal within our portfolio standard for it to be 30% by 2030. We actually have a goal within our climate action adaptation plan to have it closer to us having a greater goal of our for Columbia's to be 100% renewable energy. And I bring up those two things because they're two goals that conflict with each other. Two different plans, two different departments in the city, and it can cause confusion. And so I used to joke when I was just the sustainability manager, when people were like, oh, you have a municipal electric utility. That must be fantastic. You can get all of your sustainability goals done. And I have to explain, no. It just means that the utility you're fighting with is like 2 floors up, like you run into each other in the stairs. So you're still trying to advocate for this change in the way things have always been. And so it did help to build those relationships and to show the opportunities where you can collaborate, but it's still just as hard. One of the other things that we talk about is that, so I started as the sustainability manager in 2010, and in 2012, our water and light utility signed a long-term end-of-life plant coal contract with one of the ones Daniel mentioned, the Prairie State Coal. So we have 3 coal contracts that we have within our providing our base resources. All 2 of them, the Iatan and Prairie State, they're a little bit newer, so theoretically more efficient. One of them is the Life of Plant in Sikeston, Missouri, which Jeremy is very familiar with from your work in Missouri, that is hopefully dying in a few years, and we're hoping that it just finally gets put to bed because that'll help us. But I say that because as we're having this conversation, it takes, I just closed myself, sorry. As we're having this conversation, it takes the leadership asking the questions on where are we on this on the transitions that we're working on. Because so often, like what you experience in Cleveland, a mayor will put out a goal, you'll put out a CAP plan, but if nobody's following up and asking where are we and setting that sort of timeline, you're not going to see action. And I don't think it's all nefarious. It's not because, they're trying to just hold out you'll win or lose your next election. They're really just trying to do their day-to-day job, and they're not necessarily proactive thinking on this. And so you do have to continue to ask these questions and hopefully collaborate and work with them to move forward. One of the things that within Columbia, so I was elected in April of 22, so I'm a year and a half in. And so last summer, I asked where we were on achieving our 100% renewable energy goals. And so they've hired, they have a consultant working with us who is the Energy Authority, who is looking at our alternative options we have. Now, I mentioned those wonderful, wonderful coal contracts. In the interim report that we just received in July, that will be coming to us to City Council later, hopefully this month or next month. But what went to our Water and Light Advisory Board showed the impacts of canceling those contracts, or the estimated what it would be. So we would be impacted $726 million by divesting from our Iatan and Prairie State contracts. So just those 2 alone would impact us in that dollar amount. Also, if we wanted to transmission and retire some of our local gas units, which we use for our backup, that is $90 million. So as we're having these conversations, the discussion is like, what does this do for us? And how do we then move forward on our plans for 100% renewable energy? So, for us, there's been the discussions of, do we just have both, right? We're just getting more and more renewable energy. I saw a question about solar and some of the battery storage and things we're looking into. We are investigating that as part of our options that we have. Our utility is also looking at what sort of things can they be investing in locally. So I mentioned the non-sexy things about energy, which is like demand side management programs and the sort of energy efficiency that we have. And I am happy to say that we are increasing the dollar amount that they're investing. I think one of the problems that we've experienced in Colombia is that idea of like, did you peak too early? So because Colombia had the 2004 voter initiated for renewable energy portfolio standard, and we were some of the first adopters with Home Performance with Energy Star, which is that demand side management program for homes, and increasing energy efficiency and having rebates and loans for our community, people assumed for the longest time that we were doing great. Sorry, I can see the chats popping up. That's awesome. So people assume, that we've been this rock star, right? Like, so Colombia, because, in the 90s, we were getting awards for all of our awesome renewable energy we were doing and energy efficiency programs, that we kind of just sat back on our laurels and just didn't keep advocating and pushing. In part of that is leadership who is in charge. But like I said, it being in a municipal electric utility, but also a council manager form of government, it's not just leadership, it's really who your staff is and where they're going to educate themselves on the future. I met with Jeremy a month ago with another one of my council members, because when we were asking about what resources are available for communities, one of the biggest things that we need is to know which partners, which training, which education, which planning associations should I be encouraging my staff to be involved in, so that they are learning the future of this evolution of where we get our energy from and how we still deliver clean, reliable energy to our community members that is affordable for all. So I was happy to participate in last year, the Climate Cabinet put together the IRA guidebook, which for us was really important to look at in talking about what could we do, like what is possible for communities and especially municipal electric utilities to working on, and what sort of grant programs are going to be available. Other things that's really important for us is knowing who in their peer sector are walking the talk in this, that we can then connect with. So last year, we started, actually 3 years ago, we started the discussion about our electric rates. And as we're looking at, we just adopted a change in our electric rates in June. And the electric rates, we're increasing our percentage of our electricity rates. We have an inverted block structure. So the more energy you use, the more you pay per kilowatt hour. But it's not as big of a difference as it used to be. And so we got a lot of pushback because for the longest time, that was the way that the utility talked about how they incentivize conservation. I was noting, though, as we were looking to trying to get more people to transition from natural gas in their homes to all electric, that I knew that would affect a lot of our community members in their monthly electricity charges. So as I'm trying to get them to transition off of fossil fuels, how do I then make sure I'm not making it more expensive for them to then just cool and heat their homes? So we started looking at what is actually the impact as we decarbonize our electric utility on the rate structure. So right now, what we're adopting is a closer percentage for each kilowatt hour. But one of the other things that we're looking at too is the discussion around a low-income fixed rate charge. And so kind of following what some are doing in the California area, where you're looking at, rather than just your customer charge is the same for all, is what can you do to then look at, based on your median income, or if you qualify for other programs in your communities, what can you do to help reduce that impact for them? So I just bring that up because all of this is related, right? Both we know that climate change is impacting disproportionately our communities of color, and we also know that raises in electricity rates are also impacting. And so as I'm looking at, in Colombia, we're 52% rental households, and a majority of our rental households are all electric heat. I know that I'm thinking about those impacts to every decision we're making on those homeowners. And so really trying to think out forward on what can we do now to help reduce the impact as this changes. I don't know where I am on time, Jeremy, because I was not timing myself.
Here, you have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. And I won't take it all.
Or less, no pressure.
Okay, good, yeah. So the next thing I just wanted to talk about too is that, for us in a municipal electric utility, our residents, our voters are the ones, they're the owners, right? They're the share owners to this utility. One of the biggest issues that we've struggled with is the lack of education on what's possible and the lack of advocacy at a state level for increasing the opportunities that we have. I probably don't have to tell this group that in Missouri, it's not the easiest to put in a high transmission line that is connecting renewable resources outside of either our state or outside the communities where the farms might be. You've probably all followed that. That is causing issues all the way down, sprinkled down into locally. So as we're talking about grid resilience for us, this is becoming a very much a not in my backyard sort of conversation. And because we're in the Midwest and there's so much viewed as open land, people necessarily don't out of sight, out of mind. They don't know where their energy comes from. So one of the things that we've been working on here locally is raising up that education campaign about where our energy comes from and what we can do locally to try to have those conversations so that people are advocating on behalf of what our needs are regionally and also to our state legislature. For us in Columbia, in Missouri, when we're looking at doing things like additional solar plants or doing new contracts or PPAs with new wind farms, the transmission line has been the biggest hurdle that we've had because so many of them are not being able to get connected to us. And we're on the MISO grid, whereas some of our cities that are just about 2 hours southwest of us are on the southwest grid. And so they're getting more and more renewable resources in their mix. And so they're able to achieve their goals, whereas we are on a different one. And so it's harder for us. So Jeremy, I'm gonna stop there because I prefer question and answer as always. And because I was not as prepared as Daniel with slides, I was just talking about from our reports. And while I'm muted, I will post some links into the chat for people too.
Great. Well, thanks, Mayor Buffalo, and thanks, Daniel. I'm going to jump into questions. I think the big first one that I heard Jackson ask, and I'm hoping every panel asks the same question, is what kind of state and federal policy interventions would make a difference to make these transitions? And I'll start with you, Daniel.
So I think the biggest one right now in front of us is the IRA and the infrastructure bill money. And so making sure that folks are taking full advantage of that. I know we're working on a large Solar for All competitive grant application that the city of Cleveland is participating in. And so one of the things that we're doing is building on that relationship that we built with Cleveland Public Power leadership to get them on board to apply for that piece. But we're also helping connect them with folks like the Port of Cleveland, and other advocates and technical resources to be able, they just don't have the capacity to look at and potentially even put in all of the applications that they have. So once you've built a trusted relationship, you're not only able to have credibility to say, hey, you should be looking at this GRIP grant. You should be looking at, for example, American Municipal Power is technically a C12, which is a rural co-op designation. They could apply for New Era grants, which a lot of the rural co-ops are going after. Cleveland isn't at the place to even understand that and let alone advocate for it. But now that we're building a trusted relationship, we're able to start to point out those opportunities. And even if they don't get good answers from folks like partner communities they're able to, not having a good answer is also a tool you can use as an advocate to say, well, why are you trusting them on all of these answers from these other questions that we're asking you to pose them if they can't answer this simple one of what is their federal grant strategy? We have one for you. your partner should have an answer for that as well. So I think that piece is really the key one right now from the federal side for us.
Thanks, Daniel. Mayor Buffalo, do you have anything to add?
I would just add the piece when you're talking about for a state as well. For us, because we're a municipal, we don't deal as much with our the public power, the conversation that's happening in Jefferson City, our capital. So one of the things that has been really hard is that in Columbia, going for some of those grants, we are viewed from local grants, at least in Missouri, we're viewed as resource rich because the majority of our state is rural. So we don't often qualify for some of the ones coming from Division of Energy. I do want to say, as far as the IRA, the idea, and Brandy, I appreciated your comments earlier. That has been one of the biggest discussions we've had, is this idea of using this direct pay and what our opportunities are going to be for local. I saw there was a question about what we're thinking about for local generation, for solar and for storage. And we're trying to walk the talk in Columbia municipal operations. So on our buildings, in our fields or in our parking lots and parking garages, trying to find ways to use the solar panels to add additional solar generation in those, and potentially use IRA, the direct pay for it. But that still goes back to, we've never done it before, right? Because we've never been able to use these tax credits or have the direct pay for us. So staff is really hesitant for wanting to do something because they're scared. There's also been historically the roller coaster of investment in tax credits for renewable energy has gone up and down. That has made it hard for some places to want to invest because they're worried it's going to go away before they even finish the project, based on politics. And so as we talk about those things, there's still some of that hesitation with making those changes. But it is something that I keep pushing. And just like I said earlier about making the comments and asking the questions, I emailed again this morning, for our utilities director and city manager, like, please tell me we're going for these grants that are coming out right now. Like, what are we doing on this? I'd love an update at our next council meeting, all of that.
Oh, great, Mayor. Thanks for that. And also, just before going on to the next question, one thing, the point about staff, I think, is a lot of times overlooked. Unless you've worked in a city, you don't understand, like, you have to advocate and hold the elected officials accountable. Then you got a whole other layer after that, where you need to make sure that staff is on board too. I also think that when you're fighting power utilities, it's easy to think about nefarious and horrible things that they're doing. It's totally different on the city side, where it's the nefarious, like, it is just not their day-to-day job, and we're asking them to do something new. And I think that sometimes gets lost. Sometimes it is incompetence, but usually it is just a general wanting to do the job and not being familiar with how to do it. Next question, we just have a question from the chat.
Can I follow
Daniel?
on really quickly? And it's
Yeah,
related to the chat. So the comment was about the challenge with the large opportunities, and I think it relates to a theme of this this conference, which is thinking about how you can creatively bring communities together. And I think the Solar for All grant application that we're working on is a great example of that. So I think it would generally, this is an EPA grant to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund Challenge Competition. It does have those large awards, and it does have a very complicated, in this case, very short-term process to apply. But what we actually did was we brought together a coalition of 18 cities across kind of the industrial heartland, from Buffalo to Kansas City, to the point where the population of our low-income households that are applying for this grant collectively would actually be the 5th largest state in the country of low-income, qualified low-income households. So because we all had the individual relationships and we partnered with philanthropy in this case, we've got strong foundations in Ohio that had relationships in Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Kansas City, Indianapolis, Detroit, et cetera. We were able to find that opportunity, have the buy-in locally to bring together this coalition to apply for this grant that, if successful, would be in that 9-figure category that an individual community would not be able to apply for on its own.
Daniel, I'm going to get to Craig's question in the chat, just so Craig knows I'm going to get to it. But I did want to follow up on that, Daniel, because honestly, I'm in awe of your Solar for All proposal just to get all of those communities together. I'd love to hear, like, how did that coalition come together? You hinted at philanthropy, you hinted at some of these connections already. Like, could you talk a little bit about the process?
Yeah, so it basically was generated out of some frustration. You know, states can apply themselves, or you could build a coalition of individual communities. So some frustration, it actually really was generated in Ohio. There was some frustration with our state application, and we knew there was an opportunity. So we brought together some of the leaders working locally. So there's some organizations that work across the state of Ohio on local policy advocacy. So CUB, but also an organization called PCFO, Ohio Environmental Council, Sierra Club, others, to say, what would it look like to bring together communities of similar challenges and interests across the Midwest? And then we leveraged the foundation network to make initial outreach. And oftentimes they had direct connections to the sustainability departments of the additional communities. And we basically went on a virtual road show to those communities. You know, sort of simply explained the benefits. The foundations themselves put in seed money to help fund our work. Basically said, we will write the templates, we will put together the application, we will find the lead applicant if you're willing to sign on and dedicate your staff resources to fill in the community specific pieces. And now we've actually gone further, and we're talking to philanthropy about, regardless of the success of the application, can we keep this industrial heartland communities coalition together for solar and distributed resources going forward? So it was really just about, built out of frustration, but tracking down the resources of funders that had a similar frustration, and particularly because there's such a strong equity focus in this transition. Folks are really excited to be able to have that opportunity. So, you know, like we've done outreach to labor and other potential stakeholders and partners as well. And it was actually kind of nice in this case to be able to approach communities with an ask that was, can we bring you money? Versus the usual, which is, will you spend your money on something we want? So it was a nice change of pace for us. We were able to build a lot of momentum behind it.
Great, thanks. I know one kind of quick follow-up, about how long would you estimate that took? Just the timeline.
Well, the guidance came out June 30th, and
right.
The application's due October 12th. So we built our coalition our city coalition in about a month.
Great work. It's amazing. I'm just going to jump onto the next question. Craig in the chat wanted to ask if Columbia and Cleveland have studied your local distribution generation potential, and if so, what have you learned? And I'll start with the mayor.
Yeah, yes and no. So we just completed last year our integrated electric resource and master planning process, of which then we started to evolve for our 100% renewable energy goal. But when we're looking at, so our local distribution and local energy supply, I think it's one of the goals in our climate action adaptation plan. So the latest thing that we've done is they're looking at, for their demand side management, our current goal is around 29%. Is through demand side management. We're seeing the reduction, and we are tracking for that with our participation in our programs. The one thing that I will say is that when looking for the evaluation of new local generation, they are not creative. There's the conversation about looking at, you know, parking lots and different covers, things that I've been seeing that they've been doing in Florida municipal utilities for decades, is just something that's really outside of where our staff is looking at. So I keep trying to push on them for having that. So they don't currently have a goal related to our local distribution. I will say, and I saw, I can't remember if it was in this discussion or if it was somewhere else. It might be later on, Jeremy, you're asking me maybe about extreme weather or climate change impacts and resiliency. Local generation has been one of the key ones that we've gotten support from some of our rural county areas in our area as we start to talk about emergency preparedness in response in light of the already changing climate. And so the local generation and the potential, right now, our county is reviewing solar rules for solar farms. They did a wind farm review about 3 years ago, and they had so much not in my backyard pushback that it pretty much prevented any sort of local wind farms, or at least a utility scale wind farms, from being produced. So we're trying right now to make sure the same thing doesn't happen with our solar. Because as we talk about the local generation that is actually at the scale of what we need, that's where we're going to see the most growth or the potential impact, greatest impact in Columbia. I will comment, we've put out the last 3 years a request for responses for local solar generation. And we have yet to have a feasible response. I'm hoping that right now with the renewal of the tax credits that we'll see more responses the next time we go out. But we did just have a new solar farm was actually under construction just to the east of Columbia that we had a kind of like first option for the power purchase agreement. And then they executed the option in the plan and the contract we have with them to not actually fulfill it because they were waiting, they had a gap in their own funding. And so right now, as you drive east on 70 from Columbia, you see an under construction solar farm that is still not hooked up with coming on with us. And so this is like one of the depressing things as people are going through their own economic impacts as the opportunities here. That's what I mentioned, those roller coasters that are affecting us. They're affecting our ability also for our long-term planning.
And Daniel, do you have any insights from Cleveland?
I would say the short answer is we're not there yet. I think the reality of the competition with the investor-owned utility, the reality of a very new regime in charge here that is much more open to this type of pieces, and all the changes with the direct pay and sort of a bad taste in folks' mouths of long-term contracts, whether they would be local or not, has led to the fact that right now we're really primarily focused on what is that model, right? What would the model look like as far as, what would ownership models, distribution of benefits, rate impacts, really for like single projects or small projects, before even looking at what would a distribution wide scale capacity look like. So we're also in a place where the city is doing an overall project in looking at all the vacant land in the city, which would be likely be the most politically and financially advantageous route to go. So there's sort of like a base level of knowledge that still isn't there. But what we are doing is leaning into that overall land use project to make sure that the grid constraints and the existing substation infrastructure is overlaid into that study, so that we should very quickly be able to turn around an overall capacity piece, but kind of within the constraints of the types of projects that there would be an appetite for within the city.
Great, thanks. Well, we got about 7 minutes left, so I'm thinking maybe 2 questions. Also, I do want to apologize. I'm at an environmental nonprofit, so the lights keep coming off because I'm not moving enough. So my apologies if that's hurting people's eyes. One question for both of you. Like we've heard about little tidbits of things that we weren't talking about 5 years ago. I wish we were talking about transmission. I wish we were talking about parts of the IRA that aren't good, and that we need to be thinking about how that's going to impact our communities. I would love to hear kind of from each of you, like what are people not talking about that gets you frustrated, that you would think if we don't talk about this now, it's going to be a bigger problem later on down the line.
I'll repeat a couple of the things that I said before. I think the discussion around the impact on the cost of doing the transition, whether or not it's us divesting from our existing contracts that we have, and that huge $1 million number with what is that going to cost us, its impact on rates. And the thing that I caution this with, like, we need to start having a conversation now about how we do need to increase rates, but also at the same time create more efficient homes and businesses. And doing those things right now, I'm talking about using ARPA funds and some of the IIJA and IRA funds to invest in our local built environment, so that then as this moves on, we're not having to use as much electricity, because I am going to have to raise rates in order to meet this. And I get really frustrated when the utilities are like, oh yeah, we can't do more renewable energy because we're just going to have to raise rates. We're going to be raising rates anyway. rates are constantly going to be going up. So I'm just like, we might as well be investing in the things that we need for the future, but also creating the environment where we're not wasting the energy on inefficient homes and things that are not working for people. So that's my first one. And then the other one is, and I'm happy to see the Biden administration last week just put out additional funds to try to speed up the transmission line being built out. We have to have more transmission lines connecting our communities. I view them as like the rail system that we need, connecting, people with transportation so we don't have to be in single-use vehicles, but also just transmission lines that are connecting some of these opportunity-rich areas with resources to us. Because while I want local distribution and I want local generation, I also know the realities of the scale of which I need. The electricity demand is growing, and so that I have to supply for, with getting out that where else are we going to get this electricity from? So in Northwest Missouri, we're wind rich. And so how do I then connect those more easily to our grids?
And I'll just build on primarily the first point. I think the cost of inaction is completely overlooked. Everyone's much happier to make a non-decision, even if it's a negative impact. And I think we all know that that is a decision. And one of the things, as an example, that we probably all are familiar with is I think we're staring at a looming dramatic increase in the cost of transmission. And we're already starting to see that in the next 10 years. And municipal utilities have a unique opportunity relative to investor-owned utilities, particularly ones that are directly competing with each other, to start to allay those with smart investments right now within their distribution grid and with distributed resources within their distribution grid. So that is something, fortunately, I think Clean Public Power is starting to understands at a fundamental level, but I don't think the broader community understands that. We can't just do nothing and have rates stay the way they are. Transmission will increase dramatically, and there's other examples as well. But that's one where we have a tool in our toolkit to take action. And it may look in a scary way a lot like some of these crappy long-term contracts that we're in, but if structured correctly, they can have those long-term benefits and they can be accrued in an equitable way to the community.
Daniel, we've got time for one more question. Jay's got a question. I'm trying to figure out what it is just to make sure. But just to read off what he has is like the California fixed income is seen as a direct attempt by the investor-owned utilities to undermine rooftop solar versus help getting local solar for all. So I think maybe just talking more about just kind of the right of ways that all benefit from local solar storage community based on microgrids. And then there's a lot of dots. I'm hoping for some input from Jay, but also just looking at I think more on the theme of creating future we want, and I think it's tough because Mary, you talked a little bit about the balance of what we will need utility sized renewables, and at the same time, like if we're creating a future where there is local distribution and people are empowered to have kind of energy democracy, what would that future look like? And I may be talking a little bit about that balance, well understanding that the investor-owned utilities are not on our side for the most part and are making that much harder.
Right. So I just posted something into the chat really quick. So I'll say when I talk about the low income fixed rate, it's more of the model that the NRDC is looking at, which is where just as rather than trying, because right now a lot of utilities are trying to decide, is the model our customer charge or is our model our per kilowatt charge? Obviously NRDC for generations has been talking about, it's about kilowatt hours. So it's the per kilowatt hour. How do we incentivize people using less energy? So that was one of the ones that I've been looking at as we're talking about this here locally. I just want to also comment just something kind of Daniel said about that inaction. And for me, and I think I'm probably unique in an elected official, but I think Jeremy, you said you were kind of similar. I view right now that the decisions I'm making today is for future councils, it's for future mayors, because it's for future generations. And so I'm willing to make the hard decision now because I know I inherited all those inactions. I know I inherited all those not making the hard vote. I know I inherited the 2012 signing of the contract with Prairie State Coal that I I even worked for the city at that time, and nobody listened to me when I was saying, I don't think this is the great idea. I'm not sure that this really makes sense. Because now I'm inheriting it and I'm dealing with it. And I have two little buffaloes. Like, I would like for my children to be able to have the same quality of life I do, because of our clean air and clean water. So I just always push back when people are like, it's hard to do. And I'm like, well, we have to do something because inaction has got us to where we are today.
Well put, Mayor. And I am going to, that is our time. On that, I did want to, kind of on the final words, um, I do believe in taking the hard votes, and I completely 100% relate to just all the inherited inaction. I also want to. There was kind of been a theme of like, what can the outside do? What can outside advocates do? And I think it really comes to a point of supporting our climate champions, hold them accountable, make sure we're on the right path, and at the same time, make sure they get reelected. Because I say with a smile on my face because I have a much better job now, but I didn't win re-election. I was able to pass a lot of things in Minneapolis, but unfortunately, that was a little too fast for some of the communities. And I think that that's where, we need to bring the community along as well. And I really enjoyed hearing more from Daniel and Mayor Buffalo. I just thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And I'm going to turn it back to Eric. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you, Mayor and Daniel. I really appreciated that panel. That panel was a firsthand look at like what these conversations are going to take. So thank you for coming out and sharing that with us. Thank you all for submitting questions. We're about to break for lunch. Our next panel is going to be at 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock on the dot.